Hello and welcome to GuyLogicGaming. My name is Temco and this is Torment, Tides of Numenera, brought to us by inExile Entertainment, and they've been developing this game for a couple of years now, first with a successful Kickstarter and then quick after into the Steam Early Access program where the game has been for a while. And it's coming out right about now. So, what is Torment Tides of Numenera and what is it not? Well, it's a classic style CRPG and the spiritual successor to Planescape Torment, a far-flung set in the future game with a million different things and all kinds of mind-bending and logic-breaking ideas that suck you in. Before we dive into the gameplay proper, there are two things I'd like to note. I will not be discussing anything related to Kickstarter and broken promises or Kickstarter pledge goals or anything of the sort. The developers have addressed that early on and in my opinion have addressed that quite well. And other than that, the game is as it is and this is the game you're getting. So if you do not enjoy it, there is the Steam refund system to use. None of that makes Torment a bad game. In fact, it is a phenomenal classic style CRPG and we're going to go ahead and dive into that. Before we do that though, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the options menu and then skip on straight ahead to the gameplay section. You can do so by the link in the description below. Options wise, the game has some options. It's an isometric style game, so there's not a lot of graphical options, but you can skip intro movies and barks and objectives and tutorials and stuff like that. Then you have some languages the game is available in, as well as the input mode you prefer. I like that they've added Steam controller specifically, which is something I don't often see. Obviously, I play this on a mouse and keyboard, which I feel is the best way to play it, but frank and fair, I mostly use the mouse and nothing else really. Interface wise, we have text size changes, so if you are a little bit bad of seeing or you don't like small text on screen, you can make this a little bit bigger. I find medium, which is the default, to be perfectly fine. Selection circles are good, tooltip delay, off-screen indicators, all of that is pretty decent. Hybrid mode camera means that you can both patch pan as you deem fit as well as auto follow when you move. Pretty straightforward, no complaints whatsoever. You can change these as you deem fit. Nothing is really out of the ordinary here. Most of the things you expect are really here. Controls are fully rebindable, which is also really good. No complaints again, and everything of the game is mostly mouse driven, but all the usual stuff like mouse and highlighting and inventory and all that stuff is linked to hotkeys, so no complaints whatsoever. Pretty good. Graphic wise, you have full screen or windowed, a resolution or VSync available, and that is really all there is. You can add this dynamic cloth thing, which sort of makes clothing and cloaks and all that stuff move a little bit more naturally. It does drain a little bit more CPU power, but let's be frank and fair, this game is not a hard game to run at all. No complaints whatsoever regarding that. Sound-wise, this is one of the game's biggest assets outside of its humongous amounts of text on screen, so having master, music, sound effect, and voiceover volume is pretty good. This is a solid sound menu. We are obviously missing a couple of things here, which includes colorblind mode, which I feel would have been very nice as an addition to this game because the game does use a lot of color cues, and that would have been nice to add. As a large part of the game is text-based, that wouldn't have really mattered, but that's not in, which is a bit of a shame. So that is really the options menu in a nutshell. No complaints in PC performance. There are a couple of bugs here and there, which is, in my opinion, not really acceptable for a CRPG that has been in early access this long. They should have gotten enough feedback over the course of the last 2.5 years that this was buggy in many scenarios, and the early access build that players have been playing up until now, as well as the release build, which is the reviewer build I'm playing right here, do have some of the identical bugs available, so that means they just have been fixed, which is, in my opinion, not great. There's not a lot of them, but some of them are really annoying, and a couple require me to restart the game because it would just sort of stop working. Not the greatest. But outside of these couple of issues, no performance issues, no bugs, and everything runs smooth as butter. But what is the game all about? Well, let's go ahead and dive into some gameplay. I will continue where I left off in the story with this last save file, which means you will be experiencing some story spoilers. There is really nothing I can do about that in terms of gameplay content in this game because basically everything this game does is a story spoiler. Whether it's a side quest or a main quest, this game is very heavy on the text, very heavy on choices, very heavy on dialogue options, on exploration, and visual as well as textual experiences you encounter in the story. So doing any of those things, well, that may be a bit of a spoiler in general. Before we dive into any more of the gameplay, I'd first like to talk to you about the copious amounts of text. This is a make or break kind of deal, to be fairly honest. If, like me, you enjoy CRPGs like Tyranny, like Wasteland 2 from the same developers, then this is not a problem. You'll sit down and you'll talk to these NPCs and they'll share their stories, and you can read these stories and learn about the game, learn about the ideas behind the people who made the game, but also the characters in the world, how they interact, their interpersonal relationships, things like history, things like intrigue, things about player characters. Everything in the game is so deeply nuanced and well researched. I have no complaints whatsoever. So overall, a very, very well written game. But if you don't like reading, if you're not the kind that enjoys reading books, and by books I mean reading Harry Potter 5 times in a row, because there is a lot of text in this game, and it's not hiding any of that. Everything is dialogue driven. This is both an advantage and a disadvantage, and I'll get into that in a second. But the important part is that if you don't like reading, you will have trouble with this game. And if you do, you'll probably enjoy this game immensely, because this is the game. Making dialogue choices, more often than not, running around in the world, interacting with various objects, reading descriptions for those objects, and moving on to the next object to then read more descriptions, do more dialogue, solve more puzzles, and so on and so forth. And there is very little combat. In fact, in playing about 30 hours, I have encountered 9 instances of combat, 4 of which I could not avoid. And that is pretty phenomenal in my opinion. You can go run and gun, there's way more ways you can go into combat, but you can also talk yourself out of basically any combat encounter, either by preparing properly, by various side quests, side objectives you can do to do that. In general, there is a ton of stuff this game offers that allows you to play as you want it. And the good part about the writing in this game is not that, like many other games in this genre, and especially BioWare is very guilty of doing it this way, is that choices you make are very dictated into actions over ideas. You do not choose why you are killing someone. If you want to shoot someone in the back of the head in a BioWare game, you choose whether to shoot him in the back of the head or embrace him as a friend. 2 actions. And nothing wrong in this in and of itself, but what Torment is doing is very, very interesting in that it doesn't tell you to go shoot that character. It tells you that that character should be executed for their crimes. And if you agree, then you can choose to execute them. You can choose to banish them. If you don't agree, you might need to find ways to go around that. You need to argue your case. There is never a single side to the story in Torment, and that is phenomenal. Which also means that your personal convictions, whether your own personal as you're playing the character or you're trying a different role as the character, role-playing, are very important. And the game reflects that quite immensely. There is a feature in the game called the tides, and there are a couple of different tides. My currently dominant ones are gold and blue. Now the gold tide represents empathy, compassion, sacrifice, and basically goody two-shoes in this point. Whereas the blue tide represents wisdom, reason, and enlightenment. People that like knowledge, information, and so on. The character I'm playing is more of a mage with a good golden heart, helping everyone around, doing the white knight paladin sort of thing. Whereas if you want to go to the silver tides or the red tides, and these are not pre-made choices. The game doesn't tell you, this tide will increase your red tide, and this choice is going to increase your silver tide. You make these choices organically through the game by having dialogue with characters, and then these tides rise. You can have multiple tides active, like you see here. You can have all 5 tides in balance if you are playing that way. Or you could have one dominant tide that takes over everything else and you can play that way. And while these tides don't have direct influence on you like light and dark side of a force would in a Star Wars game, they do add a little nudge to your dialogue. If you have a golden tide, you'll have a much nicer dialogue with characters because they'll be more open and receptive to you because they trust you and they know you are a good person from the reputation you've built by solving all these quests and objectives over the course of the game. And I like this idea. It's a nice little addition on top of excellent writing, on top of all these moral dilemma choices that it allows you to do. And there is just something very, very unique and interesting about doing it that way. Now, other than that, there is a couple of other things the game does mostly through dialogue. Obviously, there is combat in the game, but most of the choices here also go around with the 3 types of effort you can cast, which is might, speed, and intellect. Lots of actions, everything from persuading someone your argument is just, from breaking open a chest, from moving over a door, from trying to grab or steal something, is related to these 3 stats as well as some skills and abilities that influence how you can do things. So if I want to open this door, I get an option menu where I can spend the amount of effort I want to spend. By default, I have 1 tile here, which means I don't have any edge on this. If I head over to my other character, you'll notice I have 2 tiles and 3 tiles already set up. That means that without spending any extra cost out of the 6 available, I already have a 40% chance. I only have 80% chance here maximum, which is not 100% obviously, so I can fail. And my main character, I can spend slightly more, and then I have different characters where I can spend different amounts. And I like this a ton. It allows me to say I'm going to spend a bunch of might here, succeed in my task, and then open the door, or fail in my task and have a retry. Based on different skills, like the ability to be a quick hands, like a thief, you can improve your ability to steal stuff. And then you have a bonus on top of the regular percentage you would use from your effort. This stat is such a nice addition because you can customize your character as you deem fit. A character that's all about being smart and being great and helpful and everything like that. You can go with int, get a bunch of that, and have all these other checks and balances regarding your ability to find stuff, about your ability to know about esoteric knowledge, about lore from machinery in the past, about access to other knowledge, reading books, casting spells, all that good stuff. Whereas a character that's might-based could have very different options, such as climbing over a hill, where you might need to find a wholly different way around that hill because you just don't have the ability to climb it. And I do like this immensely. It is such a good system that allows for such a wide range of character customization and influence in the world that the game nails very, very well. Because one of the main things in regards to games like this is replay value. And lots of very story-heavy games are only really replayable once, maybe twice if you game like Dishonored, where you have a good side and a bad side and they're widely different in how they play out. In this case, you could have dozens of playthroughs, all different because of the choices you make. And not even because you made a good choice here and now you're making a bad choice there. You made different choices. You chose to help different people, complete different objectives, even maybe not complete certain quests because they're on a timer and it ran out, or you went to a different region and you skipped a couple of quests and you came back to that region and suddenly the entire area was different. This game has so much content that even 32 hours in, I have not scratched the surface. I know for a fact I've skipped at least 3 to 4 hours of quest content because I did the main story quest before I did the side quests, and now I can't get back to that area because it is destroyed. I can't get back to it. There is so much content here and so much dialogue here that you could have many runs, many replays with the game and never experience everything identical to the same degree. Sure, you're going to find out the same main quests and you're going to figure out same different things, but different dialogue choices, even inconsequential dialogue choices, do make a massive, massive amount of difference, and that is really, really good. Now, moving away from that little part is the rest of the game. Because the game is so text-driven, and because the game is so story-driven, it is important to note that there are two main disadvantages. Graphically, the game isn't that impressive. Sure, looking at the game from the isometric view, the design part of the game is phenomenal. Everything in the game is well put together. All the scenes fit. Everything has all this atmosphere and influence from the Torment games in general. That all just feels very, very natural. Technology, magic, medieval types of civilizations, outlandish designs, everything from crashed spaceships being used as restaurants, trains with holograms in them, cesspools of living flesh from another dimension all mingled together to create this very, very hectic and dynamic flora and fauna of the world that doesn't feel cluttered and always makes sense. An immense performance, very well done by the developers, no complaints whatsoever. But then you take a look at the animations and the interactions you have with some of these objects that are very, very extensive because you have all that dialogue, but are not that well animated. And if you like visual stimuli, the game isn't that phenomenal on it. Lots of interactions end up being a white flash of light, or just your screen darkening, or your character just keeling over, or a slight effect just overlaid over the entire screen. It's not exactly what you would call impressive. And that is because the game wants you to focus on that textual dialogue. Even something called the mares, where you go in a sort of story mode aspect with a large backdrop and lots of text, has no animations whatsoever and still has several paragraphs of text with a literal background image, much like a choose your adventure book might have. While that mechanic is phenomenal and allows you to create very, very interesting choices in the story that influence things immensely, which I'll not spoil, visually, it's not that impressive at all. The background image is on gray and white, and it doesn't really stimulate you at all, but because of the story, and because of everything else involved in creating those choices and the impact those choices have on your party, on your story progression, and on your character, you are very involved. Phenomenal work, but not visually very stimulating. Another issue is that some of the stuff here is not that well polished. And I don't mean just in a visual sense. I mean that in a slightly other type of way. For example, if we leave this dialogue option here and I open my inventory menu, you'll notice I have a bunch of items here. Now, while I have this large block of cipher up here, and I'll explain what ciphers are in a second, my backpack with all my stuff is only these two little tiles here, and that is just way too tiny. There is no reason for this to be designed in this manner. The overpowering nature of this UI takes up a lot of blank space it doesn't need to, just to sort of showcase certain design elements. A very nice design that isn't functionally that great. Also, you have very little control over your character, over your visual looks, because the armor I'm wearing now doesn't really look that great, and there's really nothing I can do about that. The amount of customization options you have is limited to almost nothing. Moving also onto your character sheet, it's also again a mishmash of different choices in terms of design. You have little cubes that display what you have available, but it shows 11 intellect out of 22, but that 22 is in a small tooltip on the bottom of your total tooltip. You don't see anywhere else what your actual value is. The 2 I have here is a 2 edge, which increases my ability to do it. But I should have 3. I have 2 because the bonded item reduces it by -1. But why isn't that displayed here in some way, saying there's a calculation and there's -1 due to an item you're carrying? And there's more of these things that just aren't well explained, especially in terms of items. If I open a artifact here, there's no way for me to tell what here is a consumable item, what here is a cipher, and what here is a weapon or an artifact, unless I hover over it and wait on the tooltips. And then I have the right mouse button for details, and then I have a use button, a discard item button, but I don't have a close window button. No, that's a tiny little X in the corner. So there's design choices here that are made that I'm not the greatest fan of. Also, there's no really simple way of double checking what my characters are wearing and what they're not wearing and whether or not an item is useful for them. So you do lose a bunch of time trying to optimize what your characters are wearing, what they're not wearing. And if a character leaves the party, they just take all the items in their backpack with them. So you might lose out items you might even not know you gave to a character because you can't really keep track. And that ends up that you have to track down a character that's waiting in some pub 4 maps away because you sent them away, try and retrieve that item and juggle 4 or 5 times left and right just to get that one item back. Not the greatest way of doing things. But none of that really detracts from the fact that the story is absolutely phenomenal. And if you're playing the game for any other reason, well, I'm not sure what you're doing here. Torment Tides of Numenera is all about the fantastically rich story-driven game. And, well, that it has in spades. So that is the strength of the game. But what I haven't shown you is the combat, and sadly it looks like we will not find any combat in this area, so I'll just have to explain it to you as we go. Combat is a turn-based system, and it's not really that complex. But it does 2 things really well, and that is continued use of the unique world and style of Numenera's, the unique world and style of the Torment universe, that allows you to continuously use different unique technologies and items and objectives, and it even allows you to perform actions such as talking your way out of combat in many situations. And I've only encountered a few combat situations where I could not talk my way out of them, and most of them were because I put myself in that situation with no way to talk myself out of them. When you have that many options to talk your way out of combat, it often finds that the combat you experience doesn't feel that epic, because you're forced into encounters, often unbeknownst to you, very underprepared because it's not something you prepare for a lot in this game. You might end up with having very few action points, very low on health, and having to really think ahead about your actions. Now this is one critique I will have at the game, is that the combat is a very simplified system. It's not that fantastic. Your main character, unless you're really focusing on that, might have 2 or 3 abilities that are combat related. Your special characters might have 1 or 2 abilities that are combat related. And in a combat situation, well, you might get killed in 1 or 2 hits because your enemies are immensely stronger and there's no way to gauge that beforehand. There's no way to run out of combat, there's no way to retreat, there's also no way to try and influence combat if you don't have items directly available. Things like healing are really rare, and lots of actions are single use until you rest up again. And this is because you use both your ability set in combat as well as out of combat that you would use normally. In combat, you have 2 actions. You have your movement action and a combat action. And this is fairly logical and normal. You can also use your combat action for an additional size of movement action, sort of like sprinting would in XCOM. But what you can't do in this situation is hit someone and run away, and what often happens is that if you move forward, especially with a ranged attack character, such as somebody with a crossbow, and you don't position yourselves insanely well in the very correct spot to be able to hit a target, you can't correct that at all. You have to wait a round to do that. And that really boils down to very frustrating experiences. Also, most of the bugs in the game are related to that combat system. I've had the game crash once or twice, I've had characters bug out into terrain once or twice, I've had situations where combat would end, I would have won or lost, reload into the game, and then end up having, well, the combat never happened. I have to redo the entire combat encounter. And this is quite frustrating, especially when some of the combat encounters are really, really hard. Especially in the early game, when you don't really have a lot of abilities yet, and your party isn't well leveled, and you don't have all the items, and the ciphers are really rare still, and you don't have money to buy all this extra gear and weapons, the encounters you have are immensely difficult. Even the encounters you think, well, they're just throwaway, side quests, they should be able to do them really easily. Even in those situations, you end up having to fight for your life. And while in Undead that is pretty cool, but because you have so many different abilities out of combat, from might to speed to quick hands to diplomacy to various abilities and special things you can do as your character, it really feels restrictive during combat, where your only action, even as a pseudo demigod uber being of some description that you might be or might not be depending on your choices and desires, you end up having to fight with a club. Or maybe you have a crossbow. And maybe the little girl in your party, if you picked her up, is at all able to fight. Maybe she can wield like a stick and get hit in one blow and die. Also combat, even if you have 4 characters in your party, if your main character gets knocked out, you die. The game ends, even if you have 3 viable characters left. And the game does make no pretense of this. You are the main protagonist. I always find it weird that the characters that are not you, if you don't get knocked down, just rise back up after combat as if nothing happened. Now, they can get a temporary debuff that lasts until the next time you spend some time resting and sleeping, but it's fairly minor inconvenience for the fact that they were killed in combat and then came back. So there are some issues with the combat system, some depth issues, as well as some complexity issues in regards to the way certain things interact, and the difficulty curve on combat compared to other things, including puzzles, is very off the hook. So I'm not a great fan of the combat system. As I said, thankfully, you don't have to fight that often. In fact, the vast majority of the game is what you're seeing here. Dialogue, options, running around, exploring things, talking to characters, figuring out a puzzle, solving different aspects of everything. And if that's to your liking, Torment is fantastic. I have no qualms with it, and as soon as I finish uploading this review, I'm going to continue playing because it is a phenomenal game and it fits really well with my preferences. It's a CRPG with an immensely intense story, very well written, a unique world, very cool character design, amazing moral dilemma choices, and, well, it's just fantastic. It's a well-built game. Highly recommend it if you enjoy CRPGs. Unless, of course, you don't like reading. In that case, avoid. But if you do, it is worth every penny. I'm immensely satisfied with Torment Tides of Numenera. I feel the developers have done the original Planescape Torment a great honor in this spiritual successor. I feel they have delivered a very well fleshed out game. A worry I had during the early access, especially because I saw some of the issues with the early access build, is that the full build would be a bit of a rushed experience. But nothing could be further from the truth, and the same quality and standard of quality that the developers have had during development, during this entire time, that's still here. That is not gone anywhere. It is amazing. So yeah, Torment, Tides of Numenera. It's good. It is really good. And you should check it out. There's a link down in the description below. It should be coming out, well, by the time you're watching this review actually. So go check it out. And if you like this video, press that like button. And if you didn't like this video, press that dislike button. But to be frank and fair, you've been here for 30 minutes. You have no recourse to press that dislike button at this point. So smash that like button and press that subscribe button. Because if you want to see more content like this, that is the best way to do it. And I'll see you next time, right here on GuyLogicGaming.